Snow had a way of swallowing sound until violence tore it open. The valley lay cupped between jagged ridges, a bowl of white under a flat winter sky. Early afternoon, no warmth in the light. A mixed NATO patrol was pinned in the shallow depression at the valley's center. Bodies pressed into the snow as rounds stitched the surface in angry, straight lines. Each impact kicked up fine powder that hung in the air like breath, turning the bowl into a drifting haze. Contact front! Contact front! I can't see them!" someone shouted, voice already fraying at the edges. A vehicle near the lip of the depression burned. Engine compartment a twisted black maw pumping greasy smoke into the pale sky. One of its crew lay half fallen from the rear door, legs still inside, torso slack in the snow. His helmet had rolled meters away, stopped only by a rock, face turned toward his squad, as if still listening. The air was filled with the flat, metallic slap of incoming fire. Enemy bursts came in controlled packages. 3, for rounds, a pause, then 3 more, disciplined and deliberate. The tracers were rare but bright, curling down from the high ground where no one could see their source. Only the faint hint of spindrift whipped from rock edges when a muzzle disturbed the snow. Red 1, this is Echo Actual. Say again, grid for support. Over, the platoon leader barked in his handset, voice strained. Only static answered, a harsh frying hiss that rose and fell as if something were deliberately chewing at their signal. He shifted frequencies, tried again. Firebird, this is Echo Actual, troops in contact. Heavy, request immediate. The sentence snapped in half as a round bit into the snow inches from his hand. He flinched, ducked lower, fingers tightening around the radio like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. "Comms are trash," the radio operator shouted, hunched behind a half-buried rock, antenna bent at an awkward angle above his head. "I get half a word, then nothing. It's not terrain, sir. This is something else." Above them, on the jagged ridgeline, the enemy fired from positions no one down below could quite pin. They weren't spraying wildly. Lines of fire converged on anyone who tried to move more than a meter. A rifleman who dared lift his head too long had his helmet punched sideways by a grazing shot, sending him face first into the snow, fingers clawing at his chin strap. "Stay down, Liam," someone yelled, grabbing the back of his vest and hauling him closer to the depression center. "You stand up again, you're going home in pieces." Another burst shooed chunks from the rock they sheltered behind, rock and ice stinging exposed skin. The whole valley felt engineered. Angles chosen, distances measured. It wasn't a chance encounter. It was geometry with blood at its center. In the chaos, one young soldier tried to crawl backward, away from the burned-out vehicle, boots slipping on compacted snow. His breathing came in short, panic gasps, steam billowing with every exhale. A round hit the snow, so close to his face that ice granules spattered his cheeks. He froze, flattening himself, fingers digging into the crust as if he might burrow his way to safety. "Don't move. Don't move. They've got you zeroed." The medic's voice cut across the radio and the wind, shaky but firm. She stayed half exposed behind a low drift, gloved hands bloodied from working on the mangled leg of the vehicle crewman they'd managed to drag clear. Above all of it, above the shouting, the wild snapping of return fire, the dull whomp of distant mortar rounds feeling their way closer, there was another presence. Higher up, off to the side on a steep slope that fed into the valley, a solitary figure lay prone, just below a line of ice-crusted rocks. She was a patch of stillness stitched into the snow. Her white over-smock blended with the frozen ground, but the rifle in front of her was dark and precise, stretched out toward the ridgeline. Her cheeks were raw with cold, nose reddened, eyes narrowed behind a thin veil of frost that marked each exhale. She breathed slow, deliberate. The only thing moving with any urgency was the second hand of the watch strapped over her glove. Down in the depression, someone's voice cracked through the net. "Where's our shooter? Where's the quiet one?" It was half complaint, half plea. "If she's up there, now would be a good time." No one answered. No one had bandwidth to think about the one person they couldn't see. From her vantage, She could see almost all of them. Helmets like dull stones scattered across the snow, the smear of black where the vehicle burned, the faint red feathers marking where rounds had found flesh. Her scope traced their positions, not to linger, but to understand the pattern. Who was exposed, who had cover, who was still moving. She had not yet fired a single round. Her attention stayed pinned to the high ridge opposite. Most eyes below were fixed on the brightest muzzle flashes, the spots where an overeager gunner let his weapon jump a little too much. She cataloged those, then ignored them. Those weren't the ones killing the patrol. They were just the teeth. She searched instead for what fed those teeth. The wind funneled down the valley in gentle, regular breaths, raising ripples in the snow where it found soft spots. Through the scope, the world narrowed. A rock outcrop, a patch of buckled crust just below a cornice, the faintest glimmer of something that shouldn't have been there. A reflection that didn't match the angle of the sun. She watched the enemy's pattern of fire, counting silently. A burst from the left. 2-second pause. A single shot from far right. Mortar rounds in the distance, adjusting in clean, predictable steps. Someone up there was watching, measuring, calling corrections. The kill zone geometry wasn't just fortunate. It was being tuned in real time. Her thumb brushed the safety catch, feeling its familiar shape. The metal was cold, even through her glove. She licked cracked lips, tasted salt and iron. Radios still crushed. The platoon leader's voice floated up from below, ragged and punctuated by distant feedback. We've got, 20 minutes before those mortars walking on top of us. Before the bird waves off for weather. Less if they start bracketing for real, the senior sergeant muttered. We stay here, we die here. 20 minutes. She let the numbers settle into her spine, not as panic, but as structure. A constraint. 20 minutes for the mortars. Maybe less before somebody on the ridge decided to flank, come down, and finish what the distance guns had started. They were already ahead in this game. Every minute favored them. Her breathing slowed further, slipping into a pattern she'd practiced in wind-swept training ranges and forgotten corners of home bases. Inhale through the nose, feel the stretch across the chest. Hold. Exhale through parted lips, let the sights sink. The glint by the cornice flashed again, faint, almost shy. Not a lens flare, too steady, too purposeful. The snow there wasn't undisturbed either. Through the high magnification of her scope, she could see boot scuffs, the compressed lines of digging. A platform, just below where someone would lie observing, a radio at their side. Maybe a small device humming with malicious intent. She shifted the rifle a fraction of a degree, the bipod whispering against ice. Crosshairs crept toward that anomaly. Distance, she estimated just over 700 meters. Angle, awkward but workable. Wind, light but knifing in from her left, steadier now than it had been in the morning. The world below her shrank. The radio traffic on her earpiece turned into a muffled, distant chatter, sound of people underwater, flailing toward a surface they couldn't find. The rip of machine guns, the crack of rounds overhead, the screams, those all pulled back, too. A curtain fell between her and the chaos. All that remained was the narrow circle of her scope and the knowledge that somewhere within it lay the thread she needed to cut. The platoon leader's voice flared sharper for a moment. We're not holding 20 minutes. We need a break in this now. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, pad finding that familiar curve. She took up the slightest pressure, feeling the slack disappear. The weapon's weight no longer felt like metal and polymer. It felt like potential, compressed and waiting. The wind dipped. For one heartbeat, it was as if the whole valley inhaled and held its breath with her. Her sight picture settled. The glint resolved into part of a headset, the edge of a lens, the rounded shape of a helmet just behind the lip of snow. Not the clear, clean silhouette of a full-body target, just a slice, a glimpse. But it was enough. Her pulse pulsed through the scope in tiny up-down movements. Inhale. Hold. She eased pressure onto the trigger. Her world narrowed even further down to skin and steel. Exhale. The shot broke, crisp as glass. The recoil pushed in her shoulder, familiar and controlled. The sound of the weapon was oddly small compared to the roar filling the valley, but that single report carried with it a promise that, for someone, everything had just changed. That morning, the snow had looked almost gentle. The convoy had moved along a narrow road chiseled into the mountainside, tires and boots crunching over packed powder. On one side, rock rose in steep, dark walls, streaked with ice and stubby winter shrubs clinging to crevices. On the other, the valley fell away in a series of shelves, each one a flat white canvas framed by jagged stone. Light vehicles growled at low speed, their engines muffled by the cold air. Dismounted soldiers walked staggered along both sides of the track, rifles at the ready, breath puffing in quick, visible bursts. No one spoke loudly. Sound carried too easily up here. She walked off the edge of the file, not quite in line with anyone. Her rifle rode slung at her front, hands resting lightly on the stock, eyes never still. She scanned the slopes, the tree-line farther up, the broken teeth of rock above. Earlier, in the cramped briefing room, the mission had sounded almost routine. "We lost this bird at 0300, the captain had said, tapping a finger on a satellite image. The grainy picture showed a dark shape gouged into an expanse of white, coordinates scrawled in the corner. Weather and ice took it down. The airframe's not our concern. The payload is." He'd looked around the room, making eye contact with each person until they nodded or at least stopped fidgeting. Surveillance drone, new sensor suite, test feeds, plus a data core with the last week's reconnaissance runs of this sector. If they get their hands on it, they get to study how we see them. They figure out our routes, our blind spots. Maybe they spoof it next time. Maybe they parade it on some broadcast and call a victory. We can't let that happen. The young lieutenant had leaned forward, his pen still for once. The senior sergeant beside him had rested thick forearms on the table, gaze tracing contour lines on the projected map. "Any indication they know it went down?" he'd asked. "Not confirmed," the captain had said, "but assume yes. Everyone's listening up here. We lost contact with the drone in clear weather." That would have raised eyebrows on their side, too. The radio operator sat at the back, notebook open but empty, already thinking through frequencies and relay points. The medic idly rolled a bandage between her palms. The tech specialist had stared at the blurry image of the crashed drone like a kid looking at a wrapped gift. On the far side of the room, she'd sat with her back straight, hands on her knees, eyes on the terrain overlay. She traced every ridge and depression with her gaze, committing the shapes to memory. Here, the valley bent inward. There, a spur jutted out like the prow of a ship. She imagined lines of sight, angles of fire, potential dead ground. The mission details were important, but the bones of the land would decide everything. "Questions?" the captain had asked. Someone in the back had chuckled, jerking a thumb in her direction. "What about our sniper? She's too quiet." Thought they were supposed to be the cocky ones. A few people laughed, the sound flickering and dying just as quickly. She'd said nothing, just dipped her chin slightly, letting the jokes slide past like loose snow down a slope. Later, as they geared up near the vehicles, the senior sergeant had paused beside her, tightening his gloves. "They don't mean anything by it," he'd said quietly. "I know," she'd replied. "You see something up there you don't like," he'd added, jerking his head toward the mountain. "You say it. Don't wait for someone to ask." "I will," she'd said. He'd held her gaze a heartbeat longer, searching for something there, then nodded. "All right, Holt. Let's go pick up our lost toy." On the move, clouds had started to bunch over the peaks, thickening as the day inched forward. The light remained clear but slightly flattened, as if someone had put a thin fabric between the sun and the earth. The temperature dropped by small, steady increments, the kind of cold that seeped rather than bit. She saw the ski tracks first. They crossed the road diagonally about 50 meters ahead of the lead vehicle, a set of parallel grooves and occasional boot prints that emerged from a steep cut in the rock, then angled down toward the valley. They were not fresh enough to be sharp, but they hadn't been softened by more than a day or two of wind. Snow this high wiped stories clean quickly. These tracks still had edges. "Visual," she said over the net. "Crossing tracks on the road ahead, left to right, origin unknown." bearing 280 from my position. The lieutenant glanced up, squinting. Copy, marksman. Probably a local patrol. Keep an eye on it, but we're on the clock. Let's not turn this into a winter tourism survey. She slowed, letting her eyes follow the tracks back toward the rock cut they emerged from. The angle, the stride, the way the prints bunched slightly near the edge, none of it looked like a casual shepherd or hunter. This was someone who moved with purpose, weight evenly distributed, pauses taken in positions with cover. They pushed on. The tracks eventually dipped out of sight over a lip, heading generally toward where their map told them the drone had come down. As the vehicles crept past a boulder that leaned out over the road like a curious giant, she let her fingers trail through a patch of disturbed snow. Something small and cylindrical pressed against her glove. She pinched it up, studied it. A cigarette butt, filter yellowed, ash long gone, but the paper not yet swollen from moisture. At this altitude, in this cold, it should have been more shriveled if it had been here long. She pocketed the filter without comment, eyes flicking back up to the ridge. The mountain stared back, blank and inscrutable. The senior sergeant's voice came over the platoon net, low but clear. You good, Holt? Tracks are recent, she replied. Cigarette, but by the boulder. Not local. Too disciplined. A pause. Then, copy. Eyes up. We'll move like someone's already watching. Ahead, the valley widened. The road curved around a protruding shoulder of rock and then descended slightly toward a flat basin where the drone wreckage lay half-buried. Even from this distance, they could see the dark shape jutting from the snow, wings crumpled, nose plowed under like a bird that had misjudged its landing. The tech specialist broke into a grin. There you are, he muttered. Don't fall in love yet, the lieutenant said. We clear the perimeter first. They spread out as they approached, rifles sweeping arcs across the open ground. She drifted farther from the main body, working a line that would give her a better view of the upper slopes. Her gaze snagged on a particular notch in the ridge directly above the wreck, a shallow V where wind had carved a path through the rock, leaving a slight dip in the otherwise jagged skyline. From that notch, she realized, one could see almost the entire basin, the approach road, and a good stretch of the valley beyond. Her mind drew invisible lines from the notch down to where they were, like threads tracing an unseen net. It would make a perfect place to watch. To wait. She keyed her mic. Recommend we limit time in the open, she said. Ridge above the wreck has multiple vantage points. Notch at 1 o'clock from my position has full view of the basin. Duly noted, the lieutenant replied, distracted, already motioning the tech forward. Let's make this quick and clean. The tech trotted ahead, boots punching into the snow with more enthusiasm than caution. He slid the last few steps to the wreck, dropping to one knee beside it, gloved hands immediately searching for the access panel that would get him to the data core. Bird looks intact enough, he said. If the housing isn't cracked, the core should be. A faint hiss crackled in everyone's earpiece, like a radio left too close to a bad wire. The radio operator frowned, tapping his headset. Anyone else getting interference? He asked. I've got static across all channels. Probably terrain, the lieutenant said. She wasn't so sure. The static wasn't random. It rolled in waves, almost rhythmic. A deliberate sound, like someone dialing a knob up and down just enough to be annoying, without fully cutting them off. A test. She scanned the ridge again, the notch in particular. The sky above it had darkened, clouds bunching in a slow, crawling mass. The sense of being watched pressed against her skin like pressure changes before a storm. Higher headquarters crackled through in broken phrases. Possible movement, converging, use caution, air, 20 minutes if. The rest dissolved into a smear of noise. Say again last, red one, the lieutenant asked, turning slightly, as if changing his orientation might somehow help the signal. You're cutting. A single flat crack echoed across the basin, crisp and unmistakable. The first incoming round slapped into the snow at the tech's feet, a puff of white exploding upward as if the ground itself had flinched. The second round came barely a breath later, this time higher. It tore through the sleeve of the tech's jacket and punched a bloody groove along his upper arm. the force spinning him sideways into the wreckage. He screamed, more from shock than pain, and flopped behind the damaged fuselage, clutching at the red blooming through white fabric. For half a second, there was silence. A held breath. Then the mountainsides erupted. Rifles and machine guns roared from the ridgeline, the sound rolling down like a series of waves crashing onto a shore. The vehicles in the basin jerked as rounds hammered into their armor and glass. Snow exploded in tall fountains all around the patrol, obscuring vision, shredding anything above knee height. Incoming! Incoming! Contact high! The senior sergeant shouted, dropping to a knee and firing upslope, trying to find something, anything to shoot back at. Mortar rounds began to land along the outer edges of the convoy, each explosion a dull, heavier thump that punched at lungs and rattled teeth. The pattern of impacts crept inward, measured, not rushed. It was someone adjusting step by step, as if they'd practiced this dance 100 times. She grabbed the tech by the back of his vest and dragged him fully behind the wreck, ignoring his yelps. "Stay down," she said. "Press hard on that wound." He stared at her, eyes wide, pupils huge against pale irises. "Where are they?" he gasped. "Up," she said, and jerked her chin toward the ridge. The radio operator dove behind the same twisted hull, clutching his handset like a lifeline. "Echo Actual, this is Echo 2, taking heavy fire, request immediate," he began. His transmission disintegrated into a howl of interference, so loud he winced, pulling the headset away from his ear. The static wasn't soft anymore. It was a wall, full spectrum, grinding over every channel. "I've got nothing," he snapped. "They're hammering the net. This isn't terrain. This is someone turning a dial." The lieutenant, halfway between the burning vehicle and a cluster of prone riflemen, waved his map in a gesture that was half instruction, half desperate semaphore. "Get to that low ground," he shouted, pointing to the shallow depression at the basin's center. "Move, move." They moved. There wasn't really another option. The ground around them was alive with impacts. Staying near the vehicles meant risking cooking off ammunition if another round found fuel or stored rounds. The only apparent cover was the slight dip in the center, a place where the snow sagged a little, the earth beneath cupped into a shallow bowl. They rushed for it, hunched and stumbling. The burning vehicle rocked as another mortar landed nearby, shrapnel pinging off metal, smoke thickening into a choking curtain. One of the crew, still trapped near the cab, screamed as his leg disappeared beneath twisted steel. The medic broke from the others, sprinting low, sliding the last meters to grab his vest and drag with every ounce of strength she had. 2 riflemen joined her, bullets snapping so close around them that bits of fabric puffed from their sleeves. "Pull," she shouted. "Pull now." They heaved, and the trapped soldier came free in a spray of blood and snow, his leg a mangled ruin. They hauled him toward the depression, leaving a red trail that quickly froze into a dark smear. She kept low, using the wreckage as cover as long as she could, then broke for the same low ground, the tech limping and half leaning on her shoulder. Each step felt strangely slow, as if time had thickened. Rounds hissed overhead, close enough that she could hear the distinct rip of them cutting air. As they tumbled into the depression, she risked a glance back at the ridge. Muzzle flashes winked and vanished, always slightly offset, always disciplined. No wild, panic spraying. Each burst counted, each shot chosen. Every time one of their people moved more than a meter, fire adjusted almost instantly. It didn't take long for her to see the pattern. Someone up there wasn't just shooting. Someone was watching, directing, tuning. The platoon leader crashed into the depression beside her, snow plastered to his face, helmet askew. He clutched the radio handset, knuckles white. "Red 1, Firebird. Anyone, this is Echo Actual, troops in contact. Danger close, how copy?" he yelled. The answer was more static, a rolling, deliberate growl that swallowed his plea. He looked at the radio operator. "Switch to the satellite set," he ordered. The operator already had the backup out, its small antenna clicking into place. He flipped it on, winced again as the same interference poured through. "It's dead, sir," he said. "Whatever they're using, it's hitting everything we've got. We're cut off." Snow from recent impacts drifted down into the depression like ash. In the distance, another mortar round landed, closer this time. The shockwave pushed at their chests, a heavy hand. She peered over the edge of the bowl, brief and quick. The terrain from here looked even worse. The ridgeline loomed higher, the notch above the crash site, now an ominous black slash in the sky. The enemy had arcs that overlapped perfectly, fields of fire that raked the depression from multiple angles. They hadn't just stumbled into a bad spot. They'd been shepherded into it. The senior sergeant crawled to her side, blood seeping through his sleeve from a shallow cut along his forearm. "Tell me you've got something, Holt," he said, voice low. "No bark now. Just tired urgency. Any way to hit them from here?" She shook her head once. "From this angle, they've got defilade," she said. "We're in their bowl. I can return fire, but it'll be guesswork. I'd be burning rounds without effect." "How many do you have?" he asked. She checked quickly. A limited number of precision rounds in her primary mags. More standard ammunition in reserve. Enough to fight, not enough to waste. "Not enough to be wrong," she said. Another mortar hit nearby, showering them with snow and fragments of ice. The wounded vehicle crewman screamed again, high and panicked, as the medic worked on his leg, hands moving with practiced speed despite the chaos. The lieutenant flattened the map on the snow between them, using his body to shield it from wind and prying eyes. "If we stay, they close the loop," he said, voice almost too calm. "They've already got movement on the flanks. We hold here, we get bracketed with mortars and rolled up by assault teams. We can't push back the way we came. They've got the road dialed in. And we can't talk to anyone." His gaze lifted, meeting hers. "So," he said quietly, "how do we change the board?" She looked past him, up at the ridge. The notch above the crash site still beckoned, dark and narrow. But now, closer to her own position, she saw something else, a steep, ugly chute of snow and rock angling up behind an out-thrust spur. It was partially hidden from the basin, its mouth a jagged slit in the mountainside. She traced its potential route in her mind. If it didn't cliff out, if the snow held, if the storm didn't roll in too hard, it might spill her out on a ledge that would give a slanting view across the ridge defenses. Not straight on, but from the side, where the enemy might have left gaps. The mortar fire thumped again, another measured step inward. Time collapsed into a tight band. She felt the old fear stirring, cold fingers brushing the base of her skull. Another winter, another ridge. The memory of white swallowing the world, comms dead, orders delayed until they were meaningless. Men and women she'd laughed with disappearing into swirling snow and gunfire, the sound of their last calls cut off midward. Back then, she had stayed. She had waited for a voice on the radio to tell her what to do. The voice never came in time. "I need a route that gets me above them," she said slowly, pointing toward the chute. "That might be it. It's steep, exposed in places, but with this visibility, they'll be focused on you, not looking there. If I can get to a lateral position, I might be able to see whoever's calling fire. Maybe the jammer, too." The lieutenant exhaled, eyes following her finger, then dropping to the map as if it might magically show that chute in detail. "That's a climb and a half," the senior sergeant said. "You slip, that's it. And if they spot you, staying here is also a slip," she said, more steady than she felt. "Just slower." The sergeant's jaw worked. "We send a team," he countered. "2 rifles with you. Cover each other." She shook her head. "More bodies, more movement, more chance they notice. It has to be 1. I carry less. I move faster. You need everyone else here to keep them occupied." The lieutenant rubbed a gloved hand over his face, smearing soot and snow. "You step off that line, I can't promise anything," he said. "We can't talk to you. We can't support you. We might never even know what happened." She thought of the cigarette, but by the boulder. The ski tracks. The way everyone had half laughed at the idea of her being too quiet, then promptly ignored the signs she'd pointed out. She thought of the winter before, of frozen fingers wrapped so tightly around a rifle stock they'd gone numb, of waiting for words that never came. "This isn't about a promise," she said. "It's about math. From here, you die on their schedule. Give me a shot at changing the numbers." Silence settled briefly in the depression, thick as the snow filling the air. Then the senior sergeant nodded, slow. "All right," he said. He grabbed her shoulder, squeezed once. "Lighten your kit. Take what you need, and only that." She unbuckled pouches, shed any weight that wasn't essential. Extra layers, non-critical gear, anything that wouldn't keep her alive or help her shoot gone. She kept her rifle for magazines, one smoke grenade, a compact climbing line coiled around her torso, a small ice tool clipped to her belt. The backup radio stayed with her, even though it currently carried nothing but static. Maybe if she killed the right box on the ridge, it would find its voice again. As she checked her sling and cinched down straps, the snow began to fall harder, flakes thickening and twisting in the wind. The world blurred at the edges, depth peeling away. Of course, she thought. Of course the sky chooses now. The lieutenant leaned close. "You have 15 minutes, he said. "After that, we're out of options." "I'll try to make it less," she said. He snorted, halfway to a laugh. "That'd be a first, Holt. You doing anything quickly." She allowed herself the smallest smile. "I'll surprise you." She eased out of the depression on the side opposite the heaviest fire, belly sliding at first, then low-crawling until she reached a slight fold in the ground that gave her cover for a few meters. The enemy was still focused on the main mass of the patrol, hammering the depression whenever someone tried to move or shout. Every meter between her and the chute felt like its own world. She kept her profile as low as she could, body hugging the snow, rifle cradled in both hands. The sound of battle dulled as the storm thickened, mortar blasts turning into muffled booms behind her. The wind caught snow from the ridges and flung it across her path, sometimes blinding, sometimes helpful. At the base of the chute, she paused, chest heaving from exertion and adrenaline. The slope above looked worse up close, steeper, more fractured, sections of looser snow perched precariously atop slabs of ice. The chute funneled air upward, the wind whistling like an old kettle. She drove the ice tool into the snow, just above her, testing the pack. It held for now. She dug in the toes of her boots and began to climb. Halfway up, a stray round slapped into the rock wall an arm's length away, sending chips of stone and ice into her face. She pressed herself flat, heart pounding. Up here, away from the bowl, the sound of the enemy fire was thinner, more directional. She could pick out individual guns, hear the rhythm of their bursts, see in her mind's eye the lines of fire cutting across the basin below. She timed her movements to those bursts, climbing when the ridge guns were mid-string and less likely to notice minor shifts in the whiteness below. Her legs burned, calves screaming as she kicked shallow steps in a crust that sometimes held and sometimes collapsed, sending her sliding half a meter before she could stop. At one point, a slab of wind-hardened snow gave way entirely. Her foothold vanished. She lunged with her ice tool, burying it to the hilt as gravity yanked downward. The sudden jerk nearly tore the handle from her hand, but it held. She dangled for a heartbeat, boots scrabbling at the slope, then found purchase and dragged herself back into position. Her breath rasped loud in her own ears, the sound bouncing inside her skull. A memory rose unbidden. Another climb, another winter, snow much thicker, wind screaming so hard it turned breath to ice instantly. Voices over the radio telling her to hold, to wait. Reinforcements inbound, don't break position. You leave that ridge, we lose Overwatch. She had held. Reinforcements had never arrived. Bodies had rolled past her then, tumbling in the blizzard, shapes she could barely identify. She'd fired at shadows until she'd run dry, then just clung to the ridge as the world transformed into a white, howling void. Now, she pushed that memory down into the same place she stored the cold. Not gone, not forgotten, just categorized. A thing she'd carry, not a thing that would carry her. Near the top of the chute, the rock walls squeezed in tighter, forcing her to twist sideways, sometimes climbing with her back pressed to one wall and boots against the other. Snow poured over the lip like sugar, threatening to bury her each time she paused. When she finally hauled herself onto a narrow ledge, every muscle in her body trembled. She lay still for a moment, cheek pressed to ice, letting her heart rate settle. Then she rolled to her belly and crawled forward until she could peer over the edge. From here, the valley looked different. The depression where the patrol huddled was less a bowl and more a small dent in a much larger plate. The ridgeline facing them was closer at eye level, its crags and folds now visible in profile rather than as a single jagged silhouette. She eased her rifle onto the rock in front of her, front sight just peeking over the edge. As she adjusted the optic, she saw it, the thin, jagged line spidering across the lens. A hairline crack, probably from when she'd slammed the weapon into the chute wall during that near fall. The crack only touched one edge of her sight picture, but it distorted that portion, bending straight lines where they should have been true. She hissed softly through her teeth. The backup rangefinder, clipped to her vest, flickered as she thumbed it on. Its display glowed weakly, then winked out. The cold had eaten its battery faster than expected. "Fine," she murmured to herself. "We do this the old way." She'd studied the map. She'd walked the valley. She knew roughly how far the ridge was from the basin. She knew how wind moved in spaces like this, how temperature gradients could push bullets up or down more than a range car might suggest. She crawled the last few meters to an ice-crusted outcrop that offered both cover and a slanted view across the enemy positions. Nestling in behind it, she settled the rifle, adjusted her body, and let her muscles remember the 1,000 times she'd practiced this on distant ranges with cardboard targets that never shot back. The enemy guns still chattered, though their sound reached her in thinner strands. Between the bursts, she could hear the moan of the wind, the soft hiss of snow sliding somewhere farther along the ridge. She wiped a gloved thumb against the cracked portion of the lens, then deliberately shifted her eye to avoid the distortion. It would mean working with less field of view, less margin for error. She breathed once, twice, feeling her heartbeat slow. Then she pushed her focus back into the scope and began to hunt. From this vantage, the ridge resolved into a series of small terraces and shelves rather than an unbroken wall. She scanned methodically, ignoring the obvious flashes and looking instead for the infrastructure behind the fight. A small ledge below the crest caught her attention. It was just wide enough for a couple of men and a few pieces of equipment. Snow there was trammeled, scuffed into patterns of use rather than mere passage. Dark rectangles broke the white. Equipment cases, perhaps, stacked near a squat box half buried. She magnified as far as the cracked optics would reasonably allow. There, helmet edges, headset wires, the distinct outline of an antenna stub pushed into the air and then quickly camouflaged. Two figures crouched near the box, one with a handheld radio pressed to his ear, the other fiddling with dials on the unit. The jammer. That was the first rung on the ladder. She shifted her hold, adjusted for angle, and lined up on the man with the radio. The distance was long, but within her envelope. The wind had steadied, coming in a consistent thread from left to right. She held slightly off, compensated for drop in her mind. Her finger found the trigger, and for a heartbeat, the sounds of the valley faded again. She squeezed. Through the scope, she saw the impact. The radio operator jerked backward, chest blooming dark, headset flying from his head. His body toppled into the jammer box, striking it hard enough to knock it sideways. The other man flinched, hands flying up on instinct. She didn't wait. She shifted a fraction, let her breath out, and sent a second round into the box itself. Plastic and metal burst apart, components ejecting into the snow. The small antenna snapped, folding like a broken twig. Down in the basin, the radio operator's headset crackled. The constant, crushing wall of static fractured. For a moment, there was just dead air. Then, thin and distant, a voice bled through. Coaxial, read you, say again situation, over. The senior sergeant's head shot up. "We got a window," he shouted. "Use it." He snatched the handset from the stunned operator. Red 1. This is Echo Actual. Troops in contact. Multiple enemy positions high on the ridge. Grid as follows. He rattled off numbers, clinging to the clarity while it lasted. The lieutenant, hearing the improvement, shouted orders. "Pop smoke, short bounds. Get ready to move on my mark. We're going to that rock line to the east. We sit here, we die." Colored smoke canisters arced from the depression, landing with dull thumps before vomiting thick plumes that curled and spread across the snow. The enemy fire hesitated, adjusting to the new, obscured shapes. She moved her scope. The main machine gun position came into view, a belt-fed weapon tucked behind a rock lip, barrel already steaming in the cold, gunner hunched low, assistant feeding links of ammunition. She settled on the gunner, waited until he lifted slightly to adjust his arc, and sent a round. His head snapped sideways, body collapsing onto the weapon. The assistant froze, hands still on the belt, eyes wide. She walked the crosshairs a meter to the right and pressed again. The assistant folded forward, slumping across the gun, pinning it under his weight. A secondary machine gun team, farther along the ridge, tried to pick up the slack. They swung their weapon toward the smokery depression, but she tagged the assistant's shoulder as he reached for a new ammo box, sending him spinning onto his back, clutching his arm. Their rate of fire stuttered, then slowed. Enemy leaders reacted quickly. She saw figures moving along the ridge, gesturing, pointing. This wasn't a rabble. They'd been trained, drilled. They weren't dissolving at the first sign of resistance. A small group peeled off from the main line and began climbing a parallel spur, moving and bounding overwatch, rifles up. A hunting party. Their heads were angled toward her general sector, not the bowl. Somewhere, someone had noticed the new line of fire. At the same time, a compact drone lifted from behind a rock, its rotors buzzing like an angry insect. It rose, pivoted, and began to skim along the ridge, cameras searching for the new threat. She flattened as the drone came closer, minimizing her profile, pressing into the rock. It buzzed past, just meters overhead, its shadow cutting briefly across her scope. Her heart climbed into her throat. As it swung back in a slow, searching arc, she took the risk. She popped up just enough to get the drone in her sights. Its body wobbled slightly in the wind, fighting to hold stable. She let it by a fraction, then squeezed. The round snapped through one of its rotors. The drone lurched violently, spun, and then tumbled out of the sky, disappearing into a soft puff of snow somewhere below. For a moment, the ridge fell quiet, as if the enemy, too, were recalculating. The mortar fire, however, did not stop. In fact, it intensified, shells falling closer to her ledge now, the enemy adjusting not just on the bowl, but on any place that might be used to hit them. One landed so near that the blast slapped her against the rock, ears ringing, vision momentarily blurred. Ice and rock fragments peppered her back and helmet. She blinked hard, cleared her sight, and forced herself back into position. Down below, the lieutenant's voice threaded through the partially restored radio net. "On Holt's next big punch, we move," he said. "Sergeant, you take point. We're going for that rocky knoll to the east. If we're getting a ride out of here, that's the only place a bird can put down without eating half this valley." "Copy," the sergeant replied. "On your call." She moved her scope again, searching for whoever was coordinating the mortar fire. She found them behind a sheltered outcrop, a small knot of figures hunched over a map and a tablet, one lifting binoculars between each round, adjusting with practiced hand signals. They were farther back, partially screened, but not invisible from this angle. She drew in a breath, letting it settle the tremor in her hands left by the nearby blast. First shot, into the binoculars, shattering them and driving shards into the observer's face. He dropped, hands clawing at his eyes. Second shot, into the chest of the man, pointing at the map, the one the others had been unconsciously watching. He fell onto the tablet, sending it skittering across the snow. The remaining mortar crew froze at the sudden decapitation of their little command node. The rounds that followed landed wide and wild, no longer walking inward in precise steps, but scattering in nervous patterns. She shifted again, scanning for a figure whose posture, gear, and bearing screamed authority. It didn't take long. Near the flank where the hunting team had begun to climb, a man stood slightly apart, binoculars around his neck, chest rig heavier, weapon slung with casual familiarity. He pointed with an economy of motion that said this was not his first ambush. The climbers looked to him for confirmation before committing to each move. Field Commander. He stepped into a gap between two rocks to get a better look down toward the basin. From her ledge, that gap created a narrow window, a slit of opportunity. She exhaled, feeling the cold scrape her throat. The cracked edge of her optic intruded on the far right of her vision. She ignored it, locking on the space between the rocks. The commander's head and upper chest slid into that space like a puzzle piece. Wind steady. Distance mental math. Finger pressure. When the shot broke, she knew before the recoil finished that it was true. The round caught him clean, just below the collarbone, punching him backward. He staggered, knees buckling, one hand reaching for a rock that wasn't where he thought it was. He fell in full view of his men. For a heartbeat, everything on that section of ridge paused. The climbers who'd started up the spur hesitated, boots hovering above their last footholds. Their eyes swung not outward toward the basin or up toward her unseen position, but inward toward the spot where their commander's body lay. Discipline wavered. Then, almost as one, they began to withdraw. Not a rout. These weren't amateurs, but a deliberate pullback, caution replacing aggression. The ferocity of their fire dulled, becoming sporadic, unsynchronized. The clean geometry of the kill zone frayed at the edges. Now, the lieutenant yelled. Move, move, move. The squad in the depression surged to their feet, silhouettes blurring through the lingering smoke. They dragged the worst of the wounded, half carrying, half hauling, boots slipping on blood-slick snow. The medic ran backward at times, firing short, controlled bursts toward the ridge while still keeping one hand on the improvised tourniquet at her patient's thigh. The senior sergeant led the way toward the rock knoll to the east, choosing angles that kept what cover there was between his people and the ridge. Each time a muzzle flash dared show itself in a gap, a round from her rifle snapped in, punishing the exposure. She picked off an RPG, gunner trying to angle for a shot on the moving column, the rocket skidding from numb fingers and falling harmlessly into a drift. She winged another machine gunner badly enough that he dropped his weapon and rolled behind a boulder, more interested in his bleeding arm than in re-establishing fire. The distant thrum of rotor blades edged into her hearing, faint at first, then growing. The extraction helicopter, pushed to the limits of weather and range, was finally inbound, drawn by fragments of earlier calls, maybe by a smoke plume or a sensor feed. She kept working her ladder, always prioritizing whatever could do the most damage with the least effort. Jammers and coordinators first, heavy guns next, then the specialized threats, RPGs, marksmen. Only when those were suppressed did she spare rounds for individual riflemen who made the mistake of exposing themselves for too long. Her body ached. Her shoulder throbbed from recoil and the earlier mortar blast. The cold now bit through her gloves and into bone, but she compartmentalized it all, stacking each discomfort in a corner of her mind labeled later. Down below, the squad reached the rock knoll just as the helicopter swept into the valley, rotors tearing at the falling snow. The bird flared, nose lifting, skids reaching for the only relatively flat patch of ground that wouldn't dump it into a ravine. As it settled, the pilot kept the engines spooled high, ready to leap back into the sky at the first whiff of a serious threat. Right now, the only thing keeping the threat contained was one quiet shooter on a precarious ledge, shoulders hunched against the wind. I glued to a cracked scope, finger aching but steady. She watched until the last of the wounded were loaded, until the squad had piled in as tightly as weight and safety margins allowed. The senior sergeant was the last to board, pausing for a second on the skid to look up toward her section of ridge. Of course, he couldn't see her. The angle and the storm hid her entirely. He raised a hand anyway, fingers splayed in a rough salute to the unknown. She didn't wave back. She couldn't afford to move. She held instead, rifle still tracking the enemy positions as the helicopter ripped itself free of the ground and climbed, banking toward the valley's mouth. Only when its noise began to fade did the remaining enemy finally break contact for good, slipping back behind the ridge, vanishing into gullies and chutes and whatever exit routes they'd planned. She lay there until the sounds of battle thinned to nothing, until all that remained was the wind and her own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, she began the long, careful climb down. By the time she reached the rear staging area, a cluster of tents and prefab buildings tucked into a sheltered hollow miles from the ambush site, the sky had fully closed in. Snow fell in a steady curtain, turning vehicles gray and muting the outlines of men and equipment. The helicopter that had pulled the squad out sat off to one side, rotors ticking as they cooled. Medics moved between it and the medical tent, stretchers passing with grim regularity. The air smelled of fuel, antiseptic, and the iron tang of blood. She stepped off the last vehicle that had carried her from the valley and immediately felt a different kind of noise wash over her. Not gunfire this time, but overlapping conversations, shouted instructions, the endless hum of a military machine shifting into its next configuration. Someone called for bodies to help with unloading. Someone else demanded an update on casualties. A third voice, tight and furious, wanted answers about how contact reports had gone sideways. Above it all, in a heated tent near the operations truck, the lieutenant and senior sergeant sat before a laptop displaying grainy drone footage and a screen full of captured files laid out on a table. Intelligence officers, pale from too many days under artificial light, gestured with pens as they spoke. Downing the surveillance platform wasn't random, one of them said, tapping a document with a gloved finger. They had a schedule on us. Response times, call signs, preferred routes. They knew if they hit that bird in that valley, we'd come sniffing in pretty short order. Bait, the senior sergeant muttered. His voice was hoarse from shouting during the fight, but his eyes were clear now, if lined deeper. We walked right into bait. The intel officer nodded. The plan was to damage the drone enough that it went down, but didn't vaporize. They seeded the area with sensors to confirm where it fell, then set up the jamming and kill zone ahead of time. The goal wasn't to wipe you out outright, at least not at first. He flicked to another document, this one full of script in a language the lieutenant couldn't read. Translations were scrawled in the margin. They wanted prisoners, the officer said. Live ones, plus the data core. Interrogation, then a neat little broadcast showing your people in front of their camera with the hardware at their feet. Big win for their narrative. The lieutenant stared at the screen that showed the basin from high above, the smoking vehicle, the small shapes of his people in the depression, the faint trails of mortar impacts. His jaw tightened. That almost worked, he said. But it didn't, the intel officer returned. And that's why we're having this conversation here and not in some other kind of room. Outside, she stood off to one side, helmet under her arm, rifle slung, waiting. Her clothes were stiff with dried snow and sweat. A medic had offered to check her for injuries on arrival. She'd shaken her head, gesturing toward those whose wounds leaked openly. Later, she'd tell herself. Later, there'd be time. A staff sergeant stepped out of the operations tent and spotted her. They want you inside, he said. Debrief. The tent's interior felt hot after the cold. Her skin prickled as blood returned to numb places. She blinked in the brightness, eyes adjusting from flat outdoor light to the harsh glow of overhead lamps. The lieutenant glanced up as she entered. For a moment, some of the strain melted from his face. There she is, he said, the mountain's worst neighbor. The intel officer swiveled in his chair to face her. We're trying to piece together exactly what happened up there, he said. From the moment you saw the tracks to the moment our bird pulled out. Walk us through it. She took a breath, organizing events. The ski tracks, the cigarette butt, the notch in the ridge, the static creeping into their radios. The first rounds at the tech's feet. The bowl, the chute. When did you decide on the climb? The intel officer asked at one point. When I realized we were in a designed kill zone with no communication and no way out at our current elevation, she said. The geometry was theirs. I needed to change it. When did you notice the jammer? He pressed. When I reached the ledge, she said. Compact unit, small antenna, 2-man crew. They'd done their homework. And before that, the senior sergeant asked quietly. When did you know this wasn't just bad luck? She thought of the earlier winter, the overrun overwatch, the delay in orders while someone somewhere tried to get clarity they'd never find. The sound of a friend's voice half cut off by a burst of interference, leaving a sentence hanging in her head forever. "I've seen what it looks like when you get stuck waiting on a broken net," she said slowly. "Last winter, different ridge, similar storm. We held because we were told to. By the time Hire realized we weren't just dealing with weather, it was too late. I walked off that mountain alone. The tent went quiet. Outside, someone shouted for more blankets. I heard the static this time," she said. "I saw the tracks. The cigarette. I saw the notch. All the pieces I missed last time, or convinced myself were coincidence because the plan said otherwise. I wasn't going to do that again. I wasn't going to wait for someone to tell me we were in trouble when I could see it." The lieutenant leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "So you moved without orders?" he said. There was no accusation in it, just acknowledgement. "Yes, sir," she said. "Good," he replied. The intel officer scribbled notes, then closed his notebook. "That's enough for now," he said. "We'll want to dig into this more later. Your choices up there, they change how we look at this sector, at their tactics, and at ours." As she stepped out of the tent, the air hit her like a cleansing slap, even with the cold. The snow had eased to a light drift, flakes spinning lazily under the floodlights. The world felt oddly distant, as if everything were happening half a step away from her. The adrenaline crash was setting in. She found herself walking toward the edge of the camp, boots crunching on icy ground. Beyond the last vehicle, the land sloped gently upward toward a low ridge. Farther beyond that, invisible now, but etched into her bones, lay the valley that had tried to swallow them. The sky near the horizon glowed faintly orange where the setting sun hit cloud from below. It painted the distant ridge tops in muted fire, turning the snow there into a bruised gold. She stopped and stood there, hands in her pockets, looking out. Footsteps approached from behind, unhurried. The senior sergeant came to stand next to her, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders hunched against the lingering wind. "Intel says they've been watching us for weeks," he said, "studying routes, timings, comms habits. They didn't just know somebody would come for that drone. They knew it would be us." She nodded. "Your tracks and cigarette," he went on. "They'll be on some slide deck by morning. Case study for how to read a mountain that's not on your side. Your ledge, too. Some poor bastards are going to have to practice climbing something like that on a nice, safe training range, listening to an instructor tell them about you." She almost laughed at that. The idea of her fall, her cracked optic, her numb fingers being boiled down into bullet points on a presentation felt absurd. He glanced sideways at her. "You know," he said, "when you first got to the platoon, I figured you for a ghost on the manifest. Always at the edges. Never the first to talk. Never the loud one at the table. People kept asking me if you were up to it." "I heard," she said softly. "I told them quiet doesn't mean empty," he said. "Told them a lot of noise is usually just covering for not knowing. But I didn't know for sure. Not until today." He turned his gaze back to the ridge line, the orange glow fading slowly as clouds thickened. "The squad's alive because of what you did on that rock," he said. "Because you didn't wait. Because you saw what the rest of us missed. They'll slap a medal at this, maybe. They'll put nice words in a citation. But the part that matters is simple. When it counted, you weren't half forgotten. You were the difference." She let the words sit. They felt heavier than any kit she'd carried that day. He didn't say hero. He didn't need to. That wasn't the point, and they both knew it. "I still froze," she said after a moment. "On the ledge. For a second. When the wind dropped, and everything went too quiet. I remember before. I almost. But you didn't," he interrupted gently. "You moved anyway. That's what counts. Fear's not going anywhere. You just learned to walk with it." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the snow cover more of the traces of tire tracks and boot prints around the camp. Behind them, the camp hummed on, people moving, generators buzzing, radios crackling with new tasks. No one else spared a glance toward the ridge. That was fine. Not every story needed an audience. Her stillness, in that moment, was not emptiness. It was full of calculations, memories, choices, and the understanding that the quiet space she kept inside herself was where she did her best work. She turned at last, slinging her rifle more securely, and started back toward the tents. The valley behind her, somewhere beyond the folds of land and the curtain of snow, would keep its scars for a while. Then the next storm would come and smooth them over, hiding the places where men had bled and shouted and died. The mountain would forget. The people who had been there, who'd felt the geometry snapping shut around them, and then felt it loosen with a single, well-placed shot, would not. As she walked, the words the senior sergeant had offered earlier echoed in her mind, reshaped into something that fit the day. They'd said she was too quiet. The valley, the ridge, the men on that ledge, they all knew better now. Up there in the brittle, frozen air, one round, then another, had spoken louder than any battle cry. And somewhere beneath the falling snow, the mountain itself had learned just how loud a single, carefully chosen shot could be.